Welcome to SmithWeekly Discussions, an occasional program for our readers and listeners of SmithWeekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. We have on Rauli Partanen, Vice Chair and Co-founder of Finnish Eco-Modernists and CEO of ThinkAtom, a nuclear technology and energy advocate group based in Finland. More can be found by going to their website, ThinkAtom.net. Rauli, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us about your background and how you came to be focused on nuclear energy and technology.
Well, I started a couple of years ago digging deeper. I started a blog, so I started to do some research. I was writing mostly about resource scarcity and climate change and stuff like that. And my blog got really good feedback, and it's in Finnish mostly though. Then I started writing a book about the same subject, and that book also did very well. Got nominated for Best Nonfiction Book in Finland in 2013, which then enabled me to get grants to write more books. And I started to get a little bit desperate with the climate situation. And around that point, I read a couple important books that kind of gave me hope, and those were about nuclear. This one by Tom Blee's Prescription for the Planet, which basically describes a fourth generation nuclear reactor. So that was very exciting. And I started digging more into the kind of public discussion around nuclear. If all the stuff that I hear, we hear about nuclear energy in the media, in the social media, and stuff like that, if it's actually true or factual information or just stories that we tell. And the more I kind of dug into the subject, the more I started to notice that this nuclear option might be something very interesting and something that we have been overlooking quite a bit in the kind of climate fight. So and since then I've been kind of digging more and more deeply into the nuclear thing, and you could say that nowadays I'm at least semi-professional advocate and analyst of nuclear power. I think it's a very potential tool for helping with the climate situation.
So tell us about the work you're doing today. So you kind of mentioned the book and your website. So what kind of stuff are you doing today? What are you actively doing? I know you travel a lot.
To start a couple of years ago, we started this non-profit environmental organization called Eco-Modernist Society of Finland. It's basically a pro-evidence, pro-science environmental organization. Basically, it was a group of frustrated people who were kind of losing their hope on the climate and environmental issues, but then also recognized that our current environmental organizations are not very pragmatic in their solutions that they propose. So they're a bit more ideological, and oftentimes, well, everybody knows that Greenpeace and much of the rest don't like nuclear, for example, which is kind of in direct conflict with the thing that it could help quite a lot in the climate fight. So we did that, and it's still ongoing. I'm not the vice chair anymore, but I am their energy analyst. And about a year ago, me and a couple of friends kind of took it to the next level or more professional level. We co-founded this ThinkAtom, which is also a non-profit, but it's a think tank concentrating on nuclear, and I'd say especially on small nuclear reactors and how we could use them to decarbonize the heating sector. Because in Finland, for example, in Finland and Sweden, the electricity grid is quite clean already. but there is still a lot of emissions. I mean, in Finland, it's like 10 tons per person per year, which is quite a bit because we have a lot of industry. And that industry uses a lot of heat. So we need to decarbonize those next. And incidentally, small reactors would be a very good option for that. But we felt that, well, the policymakers are not aware of these possibilities. The regulations need rewriting, the legislation needs rewriting. So there's a lot to do before we can even start thinking about constructing a small reactor in Finland. So we kind of started doing that work and telling people about them, making studies. How I just recently released a study on how we could decarbonize the district heating networks in Finland using small reactors, for example.
Well, I want to get to that in a second. So you're the energy analyst, along with, of course, the co-founder there at Finnish Ecomodernis.
Mm-hmm.
How about climate change? Which, it's interesting that word kind of popped up. I don't know how many years ago, but before that it was, global warming. And so, maybe this climate change thing is kind of a rebranding. What's your
Mm,
thought on climate change? What's your view on that?
I guess it depends a bit on the day. But I do have to agree with the kind of mainstream science that it is one of the kind of long-term biggest threats to human well-being and environmental well-being. Uh, on the other hand, sometimes people forget that right now, for example, poverty is an enormous environmental problem as well. The fact that people don't have enough energy and they take that energy from their immediate surroundings, causing erosion and pollution and stuff like that. So it's kind of push and pull. People need more energy to get out of poverty, which also increases their kind of capability to deal with climate change. But if they use fossil fuels to make that energy, then they make the problem worse. So it depends a little bit on the day how worried about I am on the kind of climate change and how worried about I am on the poverty of people.
I think that's important because the quality of the energy is really what it's boiling down to. So how can we distribute quality energy around the world? And obviously nuclear is part of that discussion because there's
Mhm.
nothing that humans have developed that has that kind of power potential. And so I think it's a key piece. And the whole climate change thing as well is the thought of, from a perspective of a geologist, the amount of time it takes for mineralization to occur, or weather patterns. For us humans, we might be lucky if we get 100 years in our life, whereas the climate has, and the earth and so forth, is thinks in a completely different context of time. And
Mhm.
so it's really interesting, the dynamics that are at play with the whole climate change situation, and the two different sides that have kind of come up. So I want to talk about energy in general. So you've kind of looked at all forms of energy, and why does nuclear remain in your mind to be one that is the hardest to take off the energy discussion table?
Well, there's a couple reasons for that. You did mention the quality. From that, I thought that it's like the density. The energy density is one of the key things. When you utilize nuclear energy, the amount of fuel that you need to produce a certain amount is basically a million times less than if you produce that energy from a hydrocarbon chemical energy like coal or oil or biofuel or gas. So that's one of the kind of ultimate strengths of nuclear energy, but it's also one of the kind of biggest dangers because it's so dense. It's easy to make a very powerful nuclear bomb out with nuclear energy that you can kind of transport easily and stuff like that. So it's kind of like it's a very good good thing about nuclear energy, but it's also a bad thing. So it boils down to how we want to use this. But with that kind of density comes also the prospect of environmental impact. That's how much materials you need to mine to produce that energy. And in that comparison, nuclear is also very good because I don't have anything against wind or solar and stuff like that, but they do require quite a bit of materials because they utilize these kind of not so concentrated energy flows like wind or solar. So that's by definition they need more materials. Another one is land use. So you can have a nuclear power plant that produces basically the amount of electricity that the whole country needs in just one spot, a small area. But if you compare that to, for example, biofuels, you will need basically millions of hectares of land to grow that amount of energy. So that's a huge difference there. So there's this multiple things that nuclear has that makes it quite unique in both good and basically also bad ways. The energy density is one of those.
Tell me about in Finland. Give the audience, for the folks who don't know out there, give the audience kind of what the energy mix is presently in Finland. So what's kind of the key forms of energy, and then what's the public perception there towards nuclear today, and also how is that perception against or for wind and solar and these, kind of so-called, they use the term renewables, but really it's just another form of energy that does have a footprint as you just described. What's kind of the energy mix there in Finland, and what's the perception on nuclear and some of these other sources?
Okay, well, Finland actually has quite diverse energy mix. I'm just pulling this out of my head. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I think wood fuels right now is the biggest single source, and that is largely due to the fact that we have a lot of forest per capita, and we have a lot of forest and pulp industry in Finland. So when you make pulp, for example, you have a lot of residues and waste streams from that, and the pulp mills use those to make energy. So that kind of the whole industry makes a lot of its kind of own energy from the raw materials that it uses. So wood is biggest, and of course oil is a big one because it's used for transportation. Then we have nuclear. We have 4 reactors currently running, and the 5th is coming online in about 6 months' time, I'd say. It's planning the Olkiluoto 3 startup finally. We are also starting to construct the next one in a couple of years' time when the construction permits and all that paperwork gets done. We just last year it was actually start of this year that we have a vote to ban coal use in energy production by 2029, and that's all actually causing some problems. We don't have these coal plants that only burn coal for electricity. I think only one is operational in Finland, one or a couple at the most. But we do use coal for district heating, like co-generating of power and heat, which is very efficient way to use fuel. So you make electricity, but you use some of the waste heat to make district heating. And some of the bigger cities like Helsinki is currently kind of very actively trying to look for other ways to replace the coal plants that they have to shut down in 10 years time, because 10 years in energy energy world is a very short time, as you know. So probably they will be replaced by natural gas and more biofuels, simply because small nuclear reactors probably can't be built inside 10 years. But after that, maybe we will replace some of the gas and eventually some of the biofuels with SMRs, small nuclear reactors, for heating purposes. On the acceptability front, they actually did a study a couple months ago, and it had the highest acceptability for nuclear in the Finnish history of these studies. It was 49% was for nuclear and only 14% was against nuclear. So even in the voters of Green Party were more for nuclear than against nuclear, which was kind of, I think, very encouraging and even phenomenal in this sense. And we also had one Green Party member get to the parliament in this spring's elections, a good friend of mine, Atte Harjanne, and he was running on a very openly pro-nuclear platform from the Green Party, and he got through. So things are changing for the better, at least here in Finland. And I'd say that's partly, at least, thanks to the eco-modernist movement that we started a couple of years ago. So we've been discussing the topic very actively in the media and social media and these kinds of events and conferences and stuff like that. But I also think that the climate change that has been very prominent also in the media, for example, especially in the last year or 6 months, when the IPCC came out with the 1.5 degree report last autumn. It's been prominent in the media, so people are they are worried about it, and they are so worried that they are also willing to kind of rethink their views on nuclear power.
So when you come across a person in your travels or in Finland or otherwise, and you engage in that conversation about nuclear, and maybe you don't know that person is maybe potentially pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear. Let's look at from a view of an anti-nuclear person. When you talk to these type of people, how do you approach the discussion?
Well, that's a good question, and it's always a little bit depending on the situation and the person, and I guess my mood as well, because I know that from the top of my head I can remember some very frustrating discussions with some anti-nuclear people, but I also remember some very productive discussions. I will take one example. We wrote a book on nuclear and climate change in Finnish a couple of years ago, and we were invited to discuss it in the morning television show with one this kind of traditional environmentalist who was quite anti-nuclear. And the discussion was okay, fine, and stuff like that. But actually, what he said after the discussion when we got out from the studio was kind of more important to me. He said that, first of all, after reading this book, I did change my mind about nuclear. So I'm not opposing the plants that are running right now. I think it's fine to use them as long as they're safe, which was a kind of, it's usually the first step in that. He didn't want to close everything down as soon as possible anymore. But secondly, he also said that it's very good that this pro-nuclear stance comes from an environmentalist, that you get environmentalists who are arguing for nuclear. And then I realized that, yeah, that's actually the case, that for the last 20 years that he's been an environmentalist, the only people he talked about nuclear with were basically nuclear industry people. And they didn't share necessarily the values, at least openly, that he had, like environmentalism and the well-being of people and nature. But now he had somebody who shares those values come up with a pro-nuclear argument made in a sensible way, and that's a totally new kind of experience for him, and made him think that there might be something into this. And that's actually, I think that's the most important thing when I try to discuss this with new people, is to share some of the values that they have. If they care about climate, if they care about environment, if they care about, well, jobs or affordable energy or clean energy or whatever, is to try to find something to share. Because when we share something, he's very much more kind of willing to listen what I have to say. There's this saying that I like to repeat, is that people don't care that you know until they know that you care. And I think that sums it up pretty well.
Yeah, I think that does make a lot of sense, and that's a good way to approach it. That's one of the things that I think all of us that have done the research and investigation into these forms of energy and have really, for the base quality, robust backbone of energy, it really falls on nuclear, and that's for those of us who have done the research and understand that, trying to manage these discussions with people that we come across in the industry or people who don't know about it, and so forth. And so I think it's important that you have that approach. On that, I want to ask you, kind of associated with that, what does the industry participants, so maybe the nuclear utilities, maybe the advocates, what do you think needs to be done more of to better get the message out about nuclear energy to new hearts and minds?
That's a very important question. First of all, I'd say that I've read some of the history of this industry, and recently I found a book that was released in this early 1970s, and it basically states that back then the nuclear industry decided, or the utilities that had nuclear uh, power plants, they also had coal power plants and gas power plants. So there's actually no nuclear industry. There's utilities that have different kind of power plants. But they decided to shut up about nuclear pretty much because it would make their coal plants look bad. So, okay, let's not talk about them. And the only thing that they actually have been coming forth is the safety. And that makes people scared. And that makes the nuclear industry people think that they need to talk more about safety because people are afraid, and giving them more facts about this improved safety will take away their fears, but it will only make them more afraid. So I was recently invited to this nuclear communications event. I couldn't go because I had other stuff, but basically I did answer the person who invited me that just repeat these 2 steps. Step 1, stop talking about safety. The safety culture is important inside the nuclear industry, but don't enforce that outside the nuclear industry because people are not interested. And if you do, they will get afraid for a good reason. And step 2, instead of communicating and talking within the nuclear industry, go out there and talk with the people. So those are basically the 2 steps that I kind of recommend. So I've been to dozens of nuclear seminars and communication conferences and stuff like that, and they are all nice and good, but it feels that only nuclear people talking with other nuclear people, and they discuss what they should be doing, but nobody is actually doing the thing, which is to go out there and talk with other people. And then when you do that, don't talk about safety, talk about the benefits of your product. Clean, baseload, reliable energy. That's what you do. You don't, if you're a nuclear operator, you don't do safety. That's not your product. Electricity is your product. So talk about that instead of the safety thing.
I think that's a key piece. That's one of the things that also has come up on this side too. Is it's industry enthusiasts and industry participants that are talking to other enthusiasts and other participants in the same industry. And one of the things that's lacking is that effort of the industry participants to go out and talk to the folks that are maybe on the other side and pursue actively knock on their door and say, let's have a conversation about what our differences are and discuss why this industry continues and why on a global basis it's still a net growth industry, and why nuclear continues to be here, and really discuss all those topics with people openly. And I know a number of those folks is one of those is waste, of course, is something that often comes up in those conversations.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I mean, regarding that thing, that has been changing in the last year, maybe 2 years, is that the nuclear industry has been getting out, and they have been getting themselves invited to clean energy conferences for the United Nations and stuff like that. And I've had the pleasure to be invited by the nuclear industry to go there and talk about the benefits of nuclear, and how you could, for example, use small reactors to decarbonize outside of electricity production and stuff like that. So just wanted to note that it's been getting a lot better, and I hope, and I do see it as getting even better in the future, because nowadays the nuclear industry has been kind of getting its foot into the door of these clean energy and climate seminars and conferences and workshops and stuff like that. Because before that, it was, I mean, I was in Paris in the COP21 climate negotiations, and that was the 21st time that these people get together, and it was the first time that nuclear had a panel discussion at this event. First time ever after 20 years. So, and it's basically our most important source of clean energy. I mean, hydro is a little bit bigger, but it's much harder to scale up. But that kind of, for me, that was like both horrible, because it's been going on for so long and nothing has been done, but also exciting in the way that we can do a lot more if we get serious about this. So I'm kind of trying to go for the exciting side of the thing.
Right, and with even with you mentioned hydro, in a place like the United States where hydro is really on the decline. I can think of a number of decommissioned projects that used to be hydro power generation. Obviously in the United States here, you have quite an appetite for trying your hand at things like wind and solar, which have really had a lot of capital, good after bad, poured into that space within the energy industry. In Finland, is there an appetite for wind and solar, or how's the appetite there for wind and solar?
Well, it's an interesting situation regarding that in Finland. We had this campaign a couple of years ago of this quite high feed-in tariffs, or a similar kind of mechanism, a guaranteed price for wind installations, and we got basically the full campaign installations. And then there was a little bit break when the campaign ended. But nowadays, in the last year or so, we've also had announcements of new wind parks that are being built without any subsidies. So, and that's kind of interesting, that you had these subsidies, a lot of wind got built. Now you don't have them anymore here, or at least not much. There's some stuff, but not as significant. But there are still projects. But what remains to be seen is how much of those projects we will kind of have in the longer run, and how much capacity that will mean in the longer run of wind. Because obviously right now we have I think it's less than 10% of our electricity comes from wind, so it's still manageable because we also have some hydro, so you can do load following and stuff like that quite easily. But if we double that or triple that, what will the situation be in the electricity markets then? Because we are in the common grid with other Nordic countries like Sweden and Norway, who also have a lot of hydro and can load follow, but they are also building a lot of wind. So it will be an interesting situation at what point the kind of wind power starts to eat its own value in the market. Is that when there is a windy day, you get very cheap electricity, and it's hard to make money from that wind power when it's producing most of its power. So it remains to be seen, but it's interesting.
I think that's one of the areas there where people often forget about the intermittent nature of wind and solar, and the back end infrastructure that needs to be built out to be able to use those forms. And then the discussion and really the jury is still out to some degree on how long those forms, when they're built out, will last. I mean, do we get 20 years out of them? And I think that first generation on a big wide scale commercial basis is starting to come due with the kind of the first generation wind and solar. And so I think people are starting to just now begin to find out on what is the replacement, how do we handle all the parts and the wore out components that need to be replaced on these systems, because we know right now that they certainly are not catching that 60 to 80 year operating life that you might expect out of a modern reactor. And so I think it's an interesting component that I don't think people have fully thought out yet. And so it's just interesting to see what the perception is over there on the wind and solar situation.
It's a little bit worrying overall in society that if we build a nuclear reactor, nobody's thinking about the value that it will produce in 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years. They're only interested in basically the first 20 years, which makes nuclear kind of look like a bad investment because you have to build a very expensive reactor up front before you get anything done. It's similar with wind, but you will have to replace the wind turbine in 20 years. So then you have to invest again. But with nuclear, you don't have to do that. But the thing is that as a society and as investors, people don't look that far into the future, like 30 years, 40 years, even though we should, because that's the intergenerational thing with the climate change. If the climate change keeps getting worse, then it's especially the 30, 40 years that we should be looking into, in my view, at least.
I agree, because if you look at climate change in general, again, these climate change and the weather cycles and the difference in how things play out from a weather standpoint and so forth in the world, that's in a context of time that us humans really can't understand because we only live 100 years. And so when you look at a project, whether it's a mine that has a 50 or 80 year mine life, or a nuclear reactor that's licensed out of the gate for 60 or 80 years before they have to relicense, I think that's a key piece, is making sure that you set up the proper infrastructure now, even if you're not going to be around in 80 years or 60 years or whatever it is. And so that's a key point that I think people miss. It's such a shorter time frame, and I think socially and politically and so forth, economically, many of us humans think in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 7
Mm,
years, 10 years, and really can't see that long, big picture. I mean, if you look at the investment world, I mean, people can barely hang on to a trade for a couple of weeks. And so
mm,
it's that type of situation where you have that issue that continues to prevail and is present in our society and how it's set up. I want to talk about nuclear waste, and also I won't speak much about the safety record. My comments on safety about nuclear, just to kind of get you thinking a little bit. Um, it speaks for itself. When you look at the commercial operating history of nuclear power, the safety record speaks for itself, and quite honestly, it's quite impressive. People speak sometimes about their concerns for safety in nuclear, but then they're happy to go jump on a Boeing 737 Max and
mhm.
take
Or
that
a
risk,
car.
or
Or
a car that they can put on autopilot,
yeah,
and
even that.
somehow they think it's going to deliver them to work without crashing. And so there's these risks that people are willing to take, and then when they're back in the comfort of their own home, sipping up on a cup of coffee, they tend to form these crazy opinions about energy. And what about the issues with the safety related to coal? What about the air pollution from coal in China and the people that die? What about the safety from natural gas pipelines that are
Mm,
buried and go through a neighborhood in a town in the United States that randomly just explodes? What about transportation of oil by rail that comes off the rail and wipes out a small town? What about these challenges where you have an aircraft that crashes? And so, and immediately 200 people die. I don't know if the fear is about the fact that it's so instant and quick when you get in a car accident, or you get in a plane accident, or you have a natural gas pipeline explode, or you fall off of a wind turbine to your death, versus some of the longer lasting effects that people see with a nuclear accident of some kind. And
mm.
so I won't speak much more about safety because I believe it speaks for itself. But tell me what your thoughts are on what people see with nuclear waste and waste management. How do you see that in really the big picture of the world and about our much more pressing problems that we have as human beings, like poverty, like getting quality energy?
Yeah, that's a kind of that's a very complex and interesting question and discussion. Like I said, I don't want to talk about nuclear safety either. I kind of never go into it in my own presentations if I don't absolutely have to. And if I do have to, then I just say that, yeah, but it's the safest energy source that we have, according to all the evidence that we can think of and can find. And that's that. Can we discuss something else? Uh, but I do kind of, and the same goes actually with the waste. It's kind of nuclear waste has basically never hurt anyone. It has never killed a human being during the like 60 years of time that we have had civilian nuclear power plant waste. So that should tell people something, that why are they worried about it? Because it's never done anything to anyone. Uh, but the thing is that, and I blame the industry and the academia around nuclear a little bit for this, that they talk about the waste problem. They kind of keep the waste problem alive by doing more and more and more studies on how we could contain the waste and how we can find ways that it will never become into anyone's environment and stuff like that. And that makes a normal person think that this must be horribly dangerous stuff. of course, when you take it from the reactor, it's quite hot and radioactive. That's why you keep it into the water to cool down. But it gets much less hot in just a couple of years. I mean, in the United States, I've seen these pictures about the storage facilities on the backyard of the nuclear power plant. Just outside, a canister, and you can walk beside it and you don't die. And people don't get this image about the waste. They've seen The Simpsons, and it's green goo that instantly mutates everything it touches, and you get fish with 3 heads and whatever. So that's kind of like that's the popular story of nuclear waste. But the actual story is quite different. It's first of all, it's nuclear industry is basically the only industry that collects and stores its waste properly. The other ones use the atmosphere and environment as their storage. They just spread it around. Carbon dioxide is one, but also air pollution, particulate matter, and then you have, depending a little bit on the place, you have more or less robust plans for taking care of solar waste. In Europe, you do have some mechanisms to collect old solar panels and e-waste, as it's called, but in many places there is no such things. They just end up in landfills or they get shipped to some poor country where people pick them up for some valuable minerals or stuff like that, and get all the toxins and poisons from those panels. So yeah, I mean, nuclear industry is the only one that takes care of its waste.
No, I would just say that I was going to add, you had some good points about if you look at coal, the waste is really uncontrolled. It's burned off and it settles where it settles. In some cases, in the respiratory systems of human beings, is part of the disposal. And when you look at that, when you look at asbestos, certainly in the United States and other places, of course, too, but asbestos is something very monitored. The different environmental departments and agencies around the United States monitor that when you demolish a residential house that has asbestos containment, and the efforts to package and dispose of that. You have all these different systems in place, and what is really lacking is all of these in general have really an uncontrolled waste supply chain. And what that is you have, like you just mentioned, with solar and wind and some of this stuff, used electronics. I mean, think of all the household electronics that people dispose of quickly, and where those go. And there's really not a system in place to manage properly that waste. And if you look at it from a volume standpoint, it's a huge amount of volume. And then you switch gears and you go over and look at nuclear waste, and the fact that it's controlled, inventoried, secured, heavily monitored, and
tiny,
and small. When you look at it from a total volume standpoint, it's actually incredibly small compared to all these other forms of waste, whether it's residential trash, whether it's sewage, and all the other things that us as humans and consumers generate throughout our daily lives. But yet, I've never seen anything so monitored and scrutinized more than nuclear waste. I mean, what about airplane maintenance? I mean, how concerned are we with that? And so
I'm not concerned about that at all.
Right.
I mean, never even thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, and do you ever check your tires when you go on a drive? Do you make sure that the air's right? Do you make sure your lug nuts weren't loosened in the night? Those types of things. And so I think that people need to put a perspective on it that is really sensible and logical. And so I thought you hit on some good points.
Yeah, people they on the other one, on one hand they are logical, and then on the other hand they are not very logical. And as long as we talk about the nuclear waste as the kind of center point of the big problems of the nuclear industry, which is not, it's a non-issue for if you look at it objectively. It's tiny, controlled. You can dig a hole and put it there, and it'll basically never hurt anybody, and that's that. It, and it's the only industry that is actually doing this. But if you give it that much attention, like it's now given, then people logically start to think that there is something very dangerous about this stuff, because they have to give it this amount of attention, and they are spending hundreds of millions, even billions, to control that stuff and store that stuff. And it makes no sense when you look at it. I mean, we have a lot more pressing and important problems than what we do with nuclear waste, because the nuclear waste it's tiny, it's solid, it's controlled, it's not going anywhere. Just leave it there for a couple decades and let's deal with the other problems. And then if we run out of problems, then I'm happy to go back to solving the nuclear waste problem that people think is so important. But I mean, it is a political problem in many countries, like in the United States, like in Germany. Even though it's not technical problem and it's not even economical problem, it's a political problem in the sense that in Germany you cannot be a politician that starts to talk about solving the nuclear waste problem, because then you get contaminated by the topic, because nobody wants it anywhere near their area, but you have to put it somewhere. But since it's such a controversial and unpopular thing to talk about, nobody is willing to talk about it. So it's a problem, but it's generated by politics and public opinion, not technical issues or even safety issues or health issues.
That's right. No, and we have much greater other health issues and daily exposure to things like radiation
Mm-hmm.
just in our daily life, and so that's us also another key piece of it. So I want to move on. I want to talk about. I want to get your view on on mining in general. What's your thoughts on our responsibilities and practices in the mining industry? And as you can expect, the extractive industries are a key piece of our modern life and advancements in technology and so forth. What's your thoughts on global mining and what we should be doing there in relation to the environment?
Well, first I will say that I'm not a mining expert, but I've done some writing, especially from the point of view of uranium production, stuff like that. The thing is that I think with mining there is a lot of this not in my backyard or not in my country problem. At least in Finland, we have some mines that have been problematic, and when you discuss this topic with them, you kind of get the picture that they want all mining to stop or at least go somewhere else. But the fact is that with Finnish or European mining regulations, from the environment point of view, you should be doing as much mining here as possible instead of moving those mines to third world countries that have no regulation or very loose regulation, because there the mining will cause more harm for the environment. And I do think that mining is absolutely necessary. I like my computer and gadgets and my car and my house, and all the materials needed for those come from mining. So we do need to do that, but obviously I would like to see constant improvement in the kind of regulation and safety and environmental perspectives of the mining practices overall, and not just moving the mines to somewhere where we don't see them, out of sight, out of mind kind of thinking. That's very selfish and kind of well, that's something that we rich Westerners like to do. just to push the problems to somebody else, and so we don't have to think about them.
That's right. No, and you had a good point there about looking at doing more mining in jurisdictions that have good, sound science, engineering, and regulation to be able to responsibly mine with causing little impact, if not no impact to the environment, if you can do it correctly, which I believe you can. And places like Europe and the United States, Canada, Australia can really lead the way in making sure that that's done correctly, because like you said, it's such a key component to everything that we enjoy in modern life. So you mentioned uranium, so I want to bring it up to you. What is your thought on uranium today as far as mining the fuel, and what do you think's going on there as far as that, and what's your kind of overview and thoughts on uranium and how that applies to nuclear energy?
Incidentally, uranium mining is one of the topics that often come up with people who are against nuclear. They think that it's horribly messy and dangerous and spreads radioactive waste around, which I think it did especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But since then, it's been getting progressively better. Nowadays, all the workers in the Western world are strictly monitored for radiation doses and stuff like that. So there's no health hazard from that. From what I've studied, about half of our current uranium comes from this in situ leaching, where you actually have minimum mining activities. You just leach it directly from underground, which is kind of like wonderful from my perspective. And then you also have quite a bit of the production comes from like secondary sources. That you mine something else and then you get uranium as a byproduct, which is something that's actually happening in Finland. Finland right now, the radiation regulator basically gave a permission to one mine to start extracting uranium from their waste stream, which is, I think it's a wonderful thing. Otherwise, it will be left there and it will be staying more radioactive and dangerous. So why not collect it and use it to make energy? I've been also following a little bit on the seawater extraction of uranium, which has been, I think, progressing and coming down in price quite nicely. Especially from the perspective that if we do get our act together with climate change and if we do start building a lot of nuclear, then some people have been arguing that, yeah, but we will run out of uranium. But basically, no, we won't, because there's a very large amount of uranium in the oceans. And if you find a somewhat cost-effective way to get that, then you will have as much nuclear fuel as you would ever want, with quite minimal effect to the environment as well, because there's no digging. So there will be no mines. There will be just some ships collecting the uranium straight from the water. As an environmentalist, that's a kind of win-win situation for me.
Right. I think that's certainly an option that's going to be developed over time. I think that with a lot of these types of different methods for getting a hold of this mineral, there's no doubt that there's plenty around in the world. And I think it ultimately boils down to how much does it cost to get that out. And obviously, ISR and conventional mining of higher grade deposits continue to be the most economically robust. But as you look at things like extraction from phosphate, uranium expansion or extraction from phosphate mining, and also from seawater, that cost, the more time and effort that goes into the research and so forth, you can eventually get that cost down to where it'll become economic. And of course, on the other side too, the price will eventually get there. It's just like, going back again to our prior discussion about some of the waste remedies. certainly as time goes on and more work is done, it's going to become more economic to look at different recycling methods and so forth. And it's just like with uranium extraction, it's the same thing. Eventually, enough work's put into it, enough capital, you'll get to a point where it makes economic sense to pull it out and to do it. So I think it's an interesting situation with that. So I want to ask you, so what can our audience do, the folks that are listening? What can you tell them? What advice can you give them on how they can expand the effort for awareness of nuclear energy?
Well, first, it's good to get informed. If a small advertisement is allowed, I wrote this book called Climate Gamble. It's available on Amazon. That's a good place to start if you want to get informed on climate and nuclear, and especially the kind of discussion and arguments for and against the use of nuclear power. It's a very short and cheap book. So get informed, and then I'd say get out there. And especially if you work in the nuclear field, you are the expert. But it doesn't help if you don't communicate it to other people outside your kind of working field. So we need more advocates and more people. Well, I'd be using this metaphor of coming out of the closet thing. Is that because nuclear has been so unpopular in especially in the West, that people have been afraid of saying that they work in the industry or they are pro-nuclear, and they want to see more nuclear used in the climate fight. But the more people do come out of the closet and do say that, the easier it will be for the rest of people to do the same. And it's something actually that we've been seeing in Finland happening the last couple of years, that more and more people are kind of feeling comfortable in saying that no, I think that we need to consider nuclear as a solution for this or that, as well as other energy sources. So yeah, I mean, you have to be brave and bold and be the change that you want to see in the world, I'd say. I think that was Gandhi or somebody who said that.
So, Rauli, where are you headed over the next, say, 3 to 6 months? Is there some places around the world you're going to be at, looking at conferences and so forth? And can you kind of highlight a few places you'll be, just in case some of our audience is curious?
Well, I'm going to be going to China in a couple of days. Actually, there's this Asian Nuclear Business Platform conference. I'm going to give a talk there and a panel discussion on advanced nuclear reactors and what we could do with those, since that's something that I've been working on. And the next week I will be going to Romania for World Nuclear University Summer Institute to give a lecture on climate and nuclear there. And I'd say in the autumn I hope to maybe go to the COP meeting, Conference of Parties, and stuff like that. But those are not confirmed. I do hope to get some vacation in July here in Finland as well. I have some small kids who I think would enjoy some time with their dad as well. So I will try to keep traveling to minimum in the summer.
Oh, that sounds great. How can our audience reach out to you and ThinkAtom if they want to engage with you?
Well, check out the website. It's thinkatom.net. Check out Amazon for my books. There's the Climate Gamble. Feel free to email. My contact details are, I think they are available in the books and in the websites. And yeah, if people have something to say or they want to book me for some lecture or panel discussion, I'm pretty available and willing. So just email me, call me, whatever.
Well, Rauli, it's been a great discussion. Good luck with your work, and thank you for coming on.
Thanks. It was great for me as well. Thanks for having me.